One of the major things that we need to understand about the Israelites is that the Israelite understanding of religion and culture and faith were all mixed into one. There really wasn't a separation between what was religion and what was life. Life and religion were completely intertwined with each other. But we need to remind ourselves that the religion of the Jews, the religion of the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, was a religion unlike the religions of that environment that they lived in. And the reason for that is because the Jewish religion, or in fact, at that stage, the Israelite religion, was monotheist. Monotheist. Now, of course, monotheist comes from Greek, like all good words come from. So mono meaning one, theist meaning God. And so what we find is that the Israelite faith and the faith of the Tanakh is based in the concept that God is one God, not many gods. Now, for us today, that's not a big deal, especially if we live in Australia or if we live in the Pacific. We realize that the truth of it is that for us, we live in a monotheistic environment because Christianity has become the major and the dominant religion in the world. But that wasn't the case for the early Israelites. In fact, right from the time of Abraham, Abraham lived within an area called Chaldea, which is roughly modern-day Iraq. And what we realize is that Chaldea, like all the cultures around that area, were not monotheist, but in fact polytheist. Again, two Greek words, poly meaning many, and theist again, God. So they believed in many gods. Now, we need to understand that maybe they weren't all polytheist. Some of them were what is called animist. Animist. What that refers to, or what an animist religion refers to, is what we believe is that effectively even trees and stones and rivers are somehow filled with the divine, or filled with God, we're filled with the other. And you can imagine that right from the earliest time of humanity, they've wanted to believe that there was something above them. You need to remind yourself that in fact for so much of humanity's life, we've been farmers. And the truth of farmers is that as a farmer, you have got no control over almost everything that's important in your life. You've got no control over when it rains, of when the sun shines, of how much sun you get, of how much rain you get, of how fertile the soil is. You don't have any control over any of those things. And so what began to happen is that humanity very quickly began to realize that maybe there's another force at work here that brings the rain, or that makes the sun shine, or that makes the crops become more fertile. It's those things that we need to realize in terms of the Bible. That's the environment, the context in which this is happening. And so what began to happen was that because they couldn't control these things, what we began to do is to ascribe to the rain and to the sun and to the rivers and to the soil divine powers. Because we couldn't control them, we didn't understand them, we therefore made them into something supernatural. And it's that supernatural connection with the land, with rocks, with stones, with trees, that begins the concept of animism. Now, animism is still, even today, there's a fair amount of religion that is still based in an animistic framework. A lot of ancient tribal religion is animist as well. But you can imagine that as animism developed, as it began to move on, we no longer just said that the sun was somehow divine or other. We began to actually give a name. And so, for example, if you're the ancient Egyptians, you could look up in the sun and you would call the sun Ra. And so the sun gets a name, and as the sun gets a name, so he becomes a personification of a god. And so it's these gods that begin to develop. And so we see that in the concept of polytheism. And so polytheism is where now you have gods which control all those uncontrollable parts of life. And because they're uncontrollable, what we have to do is to somehow appease those gods. We have to somehow do the right thing by them. Because, of course, what we begin to believe is that these gods control our life. And so the only way in which we can get some of our what we want back is to somehow appeal to the better nature of these gods. And so what we begin to do is to start worshipping them. And the worship of the gods happens very early, and it happens throughout the whole of humanity. Wherever we've been, wherever we've found ancient tribes, we've found them worshiping, wanting to take some power back from these powerful entities and gods that have control over their lives. And so that's what happened. And so what you need to understand is that Israelite religion, Israelite culture, Abraham comes out of this polytheistic environment. This environment where people are filled with the fear of all these other gods, the God of the sun and the God of the rain and the God of the wind and the God of the rivers, and gods in all different forms. And of course, we then put those forms into a physical form by making them into something that looks a little bit like us. Because of course, as soon as you make your God look a little bit like us, you actually domesticate your God a little bit. You actually make him accessible. And then, of course, what you do is you enter in a whole new group of people, the priests. And the priests, of course, control people's access to those gods. And so people bring their offerings, they bring money, so that they can come and worship the particular god and the idol that we've now created of that god, and hopefully get the benefit from that. So appease the god's wrath, and so therefore you actually now get fertility in your soil, and the rain falls when it should, and so on and so on. And so you can realize that this was the development of how religion moved from being something which was animist, where kind of a diffused understanding of divine in everything, through to this more formal framework of many gods. But then breaks into this something fairly unique. And the uniqueness of the Israelite religion can't be stressed too highly. Because what was unique about it was that instead of saying that there's a God of the sun and a God of the moon, and there's gods in the stars, and there's gods in the sky, and there's gods in the land, that what Abraham was told, that there isn't many gods, but there is one God. One God. And in fact, every Jewish boy from the time he's had his bar mitzvah would actually say the Shema, or the prayer that is said every morning. And every morning he would say, "Behold, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, and your mind." And so what we realize is that for Israelite religion, the concept of monotheism would have been a central issue. Now, to some degree, that real focus on monotheism, on one God, really comes to its climax during the time of exile. So once all the people had been, or the leaders at least, have been taken to Babylon, you need to realize that while they're in Babylon, is they around again multiple gods, because again it was a polytheistic culture. And while they're there, they begin to think back over, why are we here? Why would the God that we believe in have left us in this place? Why would they have destroyed our country? Why would they have destroyed the temple? Why would they have destroyed Jerusalem? Why would he have allowed the Babylonians to take power over us? And of course, the thing that really comes to the fore for them at that point is to say, well, it's because we haven't served him only. And that's why when they write now the chronicle of their story up to the point of exile, the one thing that they emphasize most emphatically is that the thing that the Israelites had done wrong was that they were not monotheists, that they had not acknowledged Yahweh as the only God, but they had encouraged these other gods. God, somehow Yahweh wasn't enough for them. They wanted to cover their bases. Because of course they were in a land that believed in many gods, so they wanted to connect with that. And so when you read the Old Testament, or the Tanakh as we're now calling it, when you read the Tanakh, you realize that in much of the Torah, so much of the first 5 books of the Bible, deal with the relationship with this one God. Where you realize that God is involved in every aspect of life, whether it be what you cook and what you grow, how you live, your relationships, your family, that God is involved with all those things. That we don't have different gods, we don't have different aspects of life, but that in fact he's connected to all of those things together. And so of course during the exile, that comes out to the fore as the most important aspect. Because it is while we acknowledge God, who is the one God, that in fact we receive the blessing from that God. And so you can see monotheism becomes then the most important aspect during the time of exile. And it also becomes important then when those exiles go back into Judea and go and re-establish the nation of Israel. As they go re-establish that concept, they again uphold the concept of one God. Now it's interesting that that concept of one God, which is re-established after the exile, is also connected to the people who sent the exiles back to Israel or to Judea. The people who sent them back, of course, were the Persian Empire. And they were the other great monotheistic culture in this time. In fact, in Persia, the religion was called Zoroastrianism. There's still pockets of Zoroastrianism today. But Zoroastrianism also believed in the concept of a single God, Ahura Mazda, who in fact, by himself, would be controlling the process of life. But the interesting part is that that concept of acknowledging one God who would be the one who would do all things, who would give blessing and those processes of life, and the all-good God really begins to develop during the period of the Persian Empire. And that begins to seep into the Israelite or the Judean religion at that stage, and actually begins to uphold the concept of this all-good God. But of course, wherever there's an all-good God, we need to ask the question, well, where does the bad come from then? Where does evil come from? Well, of course, the way in which Zoroastrianism deals with that is he deals with having a demigod, so a very powerful agent or supernatural agent called Ahriman. And it's Ahriman who essentially is the darkness to Ahura Mazda's light. And it's interesting that that concept of the darkness and the light and a personification of somebody who looks after the evil then begins to seep into Judaism and later on into Christianity. And of course we know the dark to God's light being Satan or the devil. And so what we see is that we see the advent of the devil coming into the Bible, particularly in the New Testament. And a lot of that is after that influence of the Persian culture within it. So let me sum up about monotheism. Monotheism was radically different. It meant that they had one God, a God who wasn't territorial, a God who wasn't based in one particular space or one time, a God that wasn't based in that river over there or in this particular piece of land, but a God who was God over the whole world. You need to realize how radical that thought was in the time of the Israelites. It was a completely new thought, a completely new understanding of God. But it was that thought that allowed the Jews to continue to survive even when they were dispersed. Because even when they were dispersed and living among cultures which were polytheistic or even animist, it didn't stop them believing in Yahweh. Because Yahweh was with them wherever they were. And so you can understand that regardless of wherever the Jews were, regardless of where they may have ended up, they still had something which bound them together in their faith. And that was the fact that God would be with them wherever they were. A very important understanding of an Israelite distinctive.